Greetings, dear subscribers and free listeners of my channel. The Dark Lord, the main antagonist of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the terrifying enemy who for centuries spread fear across Middle-earth and brought endless grief to the races of men, elves and dwarves. This was Sauron, but he was not always like this. Once he was a wise, ambitious and beautiful Maya. In this story I will tell you how he turned to evil and became the Dark Lord, whose very name made every living creature tremble. Sauron was one of the Ainur, noble and immortal spirits created by Eru Ilúvatar himself. As readers of the Silmarillion, remember, in the beginning of creation, one of the mightiest Ainur, Melkor, brought discord into the music of the Ainur, showing defiance. Yet Sauron, then known as Mairon, had not yet turned to evil. After Arda, the world of Middle-earth was formed. He became one of the Maiar, spirits of lesser rank, the same order that included Gandalf, Saruman, and the Balrogs. He even served Orla the Smith, the great Vala who embodied craftsmanship and creation. At that time, Mairon was considered the wisest of the Maiar and the most skilled in craft. Together with the Ainur, he shaped the world, preparing it for the coming of elves and men. He loved order and harmony, despised chaos and confusion. Ironically, this very desire for perfect order was what ultimately led him astray. Soon, Melkor openly rebelled against Eru and the Vala, desiring to be the sole lord of Arda and reshape it according to his will. Many Maiar fell under his influence, attracted by his immense power. Among them, sadly, was Mairon. But in truth, at first, Sauron did not share Melkor's destructive goals. His motivation was different. He wanted to use Melkor's might to impose order and perfection upon the world. For a long time, he still served the Vala, secretly feeding Melkor valuable information about their plans. Thanks to this betrayal, Melkor built his stronghold Angband and forced the Valar to retreat to Valinor. Only then did Sauron openly join him, becoming his lieutenant, surpassing dragons and even the Balrogs in influence, second only to Melkor himself. For millennia, Sauron faithfully served the dark enemy. He commanded armies, waged war against the Elves, and when Melkor was briefly captured, Sauron secretly gathered strength so that his master would have a powerful host upon his return. Over time, he grew intoxicated with power, his will bent more and more to his master's darkness. But during the War of Wrath, when the elves and men, desperate after countless defeats, begged the Valar for help, everything changed. The Valar marched to war with all their might, and the conflict was the most cataclysmic battle in the history of Arda. The very bones of the world shook. In the end, Melkor was defeated, cast into the void. Sauron, terrified, disguised himself in a fair form, knelt and repented, begging the Valar for mercy. But they could not forgive him. They demanded he return with them to Valinor and face the judgment of Ilúvatar himself. Fearing eternal bondage and humiliation, he fled and hid in Middle-earth. For a time, his repentance seemed genuine. He aided elves and men, helping them rebuild, teaching them wisdom, and even guiding them toward prosperity. Yet the hunger for order, power, and dominion was too strong. Slowly, his ambition rekindled. Convinced that the Valar had abandoned Middle-earth, Sauron began his final descent into darkness. Unlike Melkor, he did not seek to destroy all creation. He wished instead to rule it. He devised the Rings of Power, intended to enslave the free peoples of Middle-earth. He orchestrated the downfall of Númenor, the greatest kingdom of men, ensuring its destruction when it threatened his dominion. But not all men perished. Isildur, heir of Númenor, with the Elves, formed the last alliance. In the great war that followed, they struck Sauron down. Isildur cut the One Ring, the vessel of his master power, from his hand. Sauron's body perished, but his spirit endured. Centuries passed before he was able to take shape again. When at last he rose, he gathered strength and prepared to conquer the world once more. But the tale of this final war is told in The Lord of the Rings. The Fellowship bore the One Ring across endless dangers to Mount Doom, where it was destroyed in the fires of Orodruin. With it perished the might of Sauron, leaving him nothing but a powerless shadow, a spirit of dread and memory, unable ever again to threaten Middle-earth. When the One Ring was swallowed by the fires of Mount Doom, the foundations of Barad-dûr shuddered and cracked, and the great fortress fell into ruin. The eye that had watched all lands with ceaseless vigilance flared one last time before fading into nothingness. To the peoples of Middle-earth it seemed as though Sauron was no more, undone forever, a shadow cast out into oblivion. Yet within the hidden lore of Arda, the truth of his fate is not so simple. For though his power was bound to the ring and perished with it, his spirit, once mighty among the Maiar, could not wholly be destroyed, not while the world endured. In that final moment, when the ring melted and its will was unmade, Sauron's essence was torn apart. The towering form he had assumed collapsed into smoke and flame, and the force of his malice was scattered to the winds. He was left as nothing but a shadow of a shadow, a formless wraith with no strength to clothe himself in terror as he once had. The eye that had burned like fire was quenched, and his voice, which had commanded armies and bent kings to his will, became no more than a faint whisper carried by the ashes of Mordor. Yet he was not annihilated, for the Ainur, being of the thought of Ilúvatar, cannot pass utterly out of existence while the world remains. This remnant of Sauron drifted across Middle-earth like a dying ember, unseen and unheard, unable to command or shape the world as before. No mortal eyes could perceive him, nor could he draw to himself the remnants of his servants, for the bond of domination had been severed with the destruction of the ring. The orcs scattered like leaves in a storm, masterless and bewildered, and the 9 Nazgûl, whose lives had long been chained to the ring's power, were consumed in the fire with it. Even the dark places that had once welcomed him, Dol Guldur in the south, the caverns of the Efelduath, the far reaches of the east, became closed to him, for without form and presence he could not dwell in them. It was said among the wise that the world grew lighter after his fall, as if a great shadow had been lifted. But the truth was more complex, for his spirit still lingered, and though it was weak, it was restless. Sauron, stripped of his might, retained memory and desire, and his thought turned endlessly upon itself, gnawed by bitterness and regret. He had sought to master all life, and now he could not master even his own fate. In his pride, he had poured too much of his being into the ring, binding his essence to a fragile vessel, and when it was destroyed, so too was the greater part of his power. What remained was only the faintest echo, incapable of rising again. Some among the lawmasters of the Fourth Age believed that his spirit fled into the east, where the ruins of Mordor lay silent. There, in the desolation, it wandered like smoke drifting over the ashen plain. Others thought he fled into the void where Melkor had been cast, yearning for his old master though never to reach him. Yet the most secret tradition held that he was not permitted to escape so easily. For Ilúvatar alone governs the fate of his creations, and though Sauron had turned from the light, his being still belonged to the music of the Ainur. Thus his spirit was chained to Arda, bound until the world's end, unable to flee and unable to act. It is said that Sauron heard the voices of those he had wronged. In the emptiness where he drifted, echoes of the cries of Númenor's drowned, the lament of Celebrimbor, and the screams of countless victims rose around him. He could not escape these sounds, for they were not merely memories, but truths woven into the very fabric of Arda by his deeds. To be immortal is not always to endure joy, for when one has chosen corruption, immortality becomes a curse. Thus Sauron endured an age without end, surrounded by the fruits of his own malice. Yet even in this wretched state, his will was not wholly broken. In the dark recesses of thought, he still clung to the hope that he might one day take form again, that perhaps some fragment of the ring might survive, or some servant of darkness might forge anew a vessel for his return. But these hopes faded as the ages passed, and no echo of his former might answered his call. Without the ring, he was like a harp without strings, a shadow without light. The world moved on, and his name, once a terror, became a tale for firesides. Kings and children alike spoke of him as a memory, not a threat. This too was his torment, for he had desired above all else to be feared and remembered, and now he was fading into myth. Some tales whisper that Sauron was granted a vision of the Dagor Daggorath, the last battle that is foretold at the world's end. In that vision, he saw the return of Melkor from the void, breaking the door of night and leading forth his hosts in a final assault upon the Valar and the children of Ilúvatar. Sauron longed to join him, to stand once more in power and majesty, but he was denied, for in betraying both Melkor and the Valar at different times, he had earned no trust and no place in the last reckoning. He was condemned instead to watch from afar, a powerless witness to the end of the world he had sought to rule. Thus his punishment was not destruction, but silence. While Melkor remained chained in the void until the last battle, Sauron was left adrift in Middle-earth, forced to linger among the ruins of his own making. The mountains of Mordor crumbled, the plains turned to wilderness, and still his spirit hovered there, a faint darkness that brought unease to any who passed through. Travellers spoke of strange chills in the air, of a sense of being watched though no eyes were near, and some believed that these were the last traces of the Dark Lord's presence. But he could not strike, could not speak, could not even be seen. He was reduced to nothing more than a shadow haunting the wind. In this way, Sauron's end was both fitting and ironic. He had sought dominion over every soul, yet he himself became the most helpless of all. He had desired eternal glory, yet he was condemned to eternal obscurity. He had wished to impose order upon chaos, but his own fate was the most chaotic of all, boundless existence without purpose, endless time without power. His was a fall deeper than that of Melkor, for at least Melkor still had the dignity of chains and the promise of a final role in the world's fate. Sauron had nothing but a dwindling whisper, a reminder of what he had once been. In the secret lore of the wise there is a belief that Ilúvatar allows even such spirits a chance at final healing, though not within the circles of this world. Some say that when Arda is unmade and remade and the music of the Ainur is sung anew, Sauron's discordant notes will at last be woven into harmony, and his essence redeemed. Others hold that his corruption was too great, that he will remain broken forever, a lesson in pride and ambition. But of these things no mortal can be certain, for they belong to the deepest mysteries of creation. What is certain is this. The downfall of Sauron was not the end of evil in Middle-earth, but it was the end of his power. Shadows would rise again in other lands under other names, for as long as the world lasts, the will of the children and the freedom to choose would ensure that light and darkness contend. But Sauron himself was finished, a relic of the elder days, a spirit wandering without form, unable to harm, unable to heal. And so the tale closes not with fire and ruin, but with silence. For the greatest punishment of the Dark Lord was not death, nor chains, nor battle lost, but the eternal emptiness of being forgotten. The enemy of all free peoples became at last no more than a rumour carried on the wind, a faint shiver in the night destined to fade until the remaking of the world.